issues happening. On one side, presenting sort of alternative modernity. This is how they presented it, or another way to understand conceptual art that was non-Western. So this was, if you read that part that you mentioned, it is a discourse that is also happening on other parts of the world. So yeah, I think it's interesting to see, for me, that it's a kind of, let's say, that like a zeitgeist in different countries. There are things that were happening during the Cold War that were more or less, without knowing, maybe connected. And I think that's interesting for me to know, because I have no clue how it was in Asia or in Africa. I have no idea about these continents, not much. A little bit about Indonesia, because I've been working quite a lot there. And I know Jimsu Pangkat also, but the rest I can say that it might have been a parallel happening, this kind of questioning and decolonizing the way to address not only art, but the issue of modernity, because that's the point where it starts. Modernity is seen as something completely European, and it is, I don't think it is completely European, because the idea of modernity itself has to do also with the past. So it's not only something that just pop up from nothing. So that's just an idea, yeah.
But just going off that, two things. Firstly, with regards to modernity not being European and that there's like global modernisms, I get that. But I also feel, but maybe just because of where I'm situated, I feel like there's always this drive for Western art institutions in order to justify including art from Africa or Asia, wherever that was made in that particular era, whether it's the 50s, 60s, 70s, whatever, to include it in a modernist framework. And I'm not, sometimes, or most of the time now, I'm not even convinced that it necessarily has to belong to that. And I wish that there was another sort of, I don't know, terminology or framework in order to understand these works, which there is when you step outside of a Western framework, basically. So I'm drawn less to this constant need to justify things as a global modernism. And secondly, I'm also interested in that there was like a quotation by Vijay Prashad about the adoption of science, or Western science, and I guess that makes me think also about architecture in these particular, especially in the metropole of different African and Asian cities. And it makes me think a lot about Chandigarh in India, especially at the time when India had just been emancipated, and Nehru asking Le Corbusier to design the new capital for a modern India. And it's interesting now because I feel, and maybe people could actually give me some links to some reading around this, but I do feel like that has this adoption of a Western modernist architecture in those particular moments in time is still romanticized and still seen as really interesting case studies. But I feel like I've never actually seen proper criticism of that, I guess, fashion of the time. So for example, if you actually go to Chandigarh, you see the failure of that movement, and I never really see criticism of that. So if people actually have links of people who have written extensive criticism of the failure of that movement throughout that particular area of the world, I'd be really interested in it, because I just think it keeps getting, I don't know, I saw an exhibition of that years ago in Paris, where it just was, I think people were really fascinated by the fact that this Western language of architecture was adopted in this moment of emancipation, and I just sort of want to find ways to reject it.
It is interesting, if I may say so. Corbusier was driving his inspiration from the Orient. Basically, it's very interesting that his early study trip to Istanbul influence his views and his contributions to modern architecture. So I see, for example, but I'm like Middle European, Eastern European, but I see as an art historian Chandigarh as a very good example of respect towards heritage and reinterpretation of modernist values. I mean, what would you expect from Corbusier? He incorporated, I believe, Indian tradition when he was building it in certain features. I think he echoed it with his design. I mean, you see it differently, but
I think it's important to emphasize that the Enlightenment and the period of colonialism depends on new inventions, apparatuses, instruments that are all to do with visuality, and art in that sense is completely implicated in that colonial history, and you cannot remove yourself from that in order to theorize something. But the way to do so has been done via an attempt to neglect that and begin again, which is what Arjuna Padurai is trying to do through anthropological kind of a lens. Or what we are doing now, trying to connect from the now. So like we don't have histories, but let's work together. Let's kind of think of solidarity as a thing that we share first and foremost, and then connect through that scope. However, you can't come in to the world without those histories. And in the text, there are already references that are contemporary, even though they are historical now, they are rejuvenated for the purpose of a contemporary thought or contemporary conditions. So Achille Mbembe, that has been mentioned in the text, is now profusely used by Marina Grženić, for example, an art historian that is talking and thinking about biopower. So the migration as a kind of form of slavery, moving bodies through different territories and histories for the purpose of survival or being utilized as labor. So all of this is incredibly interesting as a kind of an attempt to find a different solution to the way we live, considering that we are witnessing that capitalism is not working, and we are trying to look in models that could provide some kind of hope for a different way of being together as nations, if that is as communities rather than as nations. Although with this Corona thing, we all got back to nations, so all the work that we've done, damn, gone. Sorry.
With Corona business, it's just the opposite.
Oh yeah? Sorry.
I'm joking. It's a global threat. It's globalization in the worst form.
Yeah. I don't know. I need to think through what's happening. I'm still not getting it.
Yeah, you are right. We'll see. We'll see what is it.
Anyway. Yeah, so I'll put the references that I mentioned.
Thank you.
Yes, I think it's interesting to think about some of the remnants, in a way, of the alignment movement through architecture and culture. I think I was really struck by this actually in Bangladesh. I was also really struck by this when I was in Ghana and Accra, especially in Accra. I found it a little bit strange that this kind of Eastern European, very Soviet-looking architecture. And so it's quite interesting just to think about how alignments also create, I think I really like this, Christian, when you talk about tendencies, what those political tendencies might be, what those cultural tendencies might be, and what they kind of represent. Yeah, I mean, I don't think this is at all related to the non-aligned movement, but the parliamentary building in Bangladesh, I don't know if you've ever seen it, but it's this building by Louis Kahn, and it's so striking, and you can't help but sort of think about the relationship between maybe forming new, political ideas and ideologies, and in relation to architecture, and how you can maybe point to this, through the kinds of infrastructure and architecture which is developed or made. So yeah, I find that something that's still quite resonant for me. I mean, I think the thing that you mentioned about the multiple modernities, and Rita, and what frame we can look into this in is for me, it's extremely difficult to still shift my angle of how to enter, because I always find myself actually entering exactly the same way, even if I feel as if I'm and that's to do with many things, but I think it might also be due to the fact that I don't necessarily have languages or words to describe that other framework that I want to kind of enter into, and obviously that requires quite a bit of work. And I think but I guess I'm still struck very much by how little, in a way, well, maybe I'm wrong in saying this, but maybe how little shifted. I wanted to know, and maybe some people have done more research on this, but due to the non-aligned movement, actually what kinds of geopolitical impact was actually made? What was it actually able to shape or form in terms of that non-alignment?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think in relation to both your points, and I think that the full text mentions that a bit more, and the whole publication I think goes into deeper detail into, especially as you were mentioning, Amrita, about this architectural language and this kind of exchange of architectural language. And then in terms of the economic aid programs and kind of geopolitical alliances that formed. So there's a lot, and I think there's still a lot to uncover, actually. But I think, yeah, perhaps the rest of the text is a good introduction. But yeah, that's a very interesting point you raised about architecture. And thanks for everybody sharing amazing links in the chat. I feel this is a real gold mine that's happening on the side. I just looked at it now, and it's an incredible bibliography that we have.
I just want to say as well that Sepaki mentioned you're entering all over again through the same door, and I just want to say that I wrote that the work in relation to changing that entrance is a kind of life work. It's the change of mindset, and it's incredibly hard. We are culturally conditioned. So how else are you going to enter when you're kind of taught, driven by hand to that particular entrance? So what's important to know is that Bojana Piškur, who wrote this text, is also part of the collective that is to do with radical pedagogy. So it is a group of people that is interested in precisely working on the shifting those mindset, how we do that, how we mobilize the crowd to think differently in their own territory. It is something that is a kind of almost impossible, and we all want to do that. We would all love to be able to do that or inspire others to do that, but it is incredibly hard to propose such a thing and then to instrumentalize it. It's just, yeah, so don't worry about it. Just keep trying.
is it possible to ask a question then for those who work in institutions and universities? How are people thinking about this to this idea of radical pedagogy, which I'd love to hear more on at some point, and that this is a thing we're chasing. If we think about the architecture of knowledge in our institutions and what that does in the mind, what it does in the body, how are we thinking about that differently in light of this kind of conversation?
Can I just say, I have to say that's a huge question, and it could almost have its own its own event in itself. I mean, I think one thing, you know, I don't know if you remember, but just before, I mean, it wasn't so long ago, but just before, obviously, the pandemic kind of was sort of officially announced, and, you know, institutions and spaces started to close down. You know, 2 weeks before, there'd been, you know, a number of strikes across the country, sort of relating to the, you know, rights of lecturers, you know, pension, pay, you know, a number of things. And I don't know about you, but I was really struck by the small numbers of people who were part of those protests. I mean, I don't know if that was different in different parts of the country, but I was really struck by the fact that the students weren't necessarily supporting their professors in that way. Something that really struck me. And it just made me sort of think about, you know, those questions of when we're sort of thinking about how do we align, you know, what is the thing that we are fighting for is, I think, needs to be really clear, just in terms of shifts that we want to make in educational realms.
Is anyone else working in the institution?
Yeah, I work in an art institution, so I don't work in education, but in terms of this question of into the international question, so I work at Tate Modern, and it's interesting because it's kind of been developed into this question of the transnational. But again, this is why I have frustrations with regards to looking through the lens of modernity, because that's where my frustration came from, was actually viewing colleagues and overhearing conversations with regard, like seeing it through their eyes, and basically in terms of international acquisitions being justified through the language of Western art history. So I don't necessarily see any evidence or proof of the positive attributes of what we've been talking about being adopted in our institutions, but more actually being co-opted in order to develop an international network, an international financial network as well. And it'll be interesting to see how this potentially could change or be reduced after what, you know, the COVID situation. But yeah, I'm not, because from what I see in terms of this international art network, it's still you know, the spreading of knowledge and this conversation is held in very small elite circles, and it's not necessarily through the language or way of communication of the places that they're traveling to. It's done very much on, you know, the terms of the institution and the ways of seeing of the institution. So for me, that's not really displacing anything, although that is the objective, is to expand art history. But again, this question of expanding, well, where are you expanding from? You're expanding from one point, which is the UK. So it should be a displacement or a decentering, but those questions are not really discussed. So yeah, I'm not positive about it.
respond on that, then I love this conversation. This takes me back again to this idea of the centre cannot hold. So the Chinua Achebe title of a book, and those centres they are falling apart. And how do we reform them, but they're not the same thing somewhere else? So I'm really excited to see what those possibilities are of this decentering that is something different. It's not the same old, same old. Yeah, this has really given me a lot to think about. Thank you. One thing to add was, in looking at what's happening in Peru right now, I mean, I don't know how the news is accurate and up to date, the news that I'm watching, but I thought it was fascinating to see people who have given up on capitalism and they're just going home. You know, they're leaving those cities and they're going back to their rural, you know, perspectives. And actually, that is global companies falling apart because their workers are just like, well, why would we stay here? So I think there's something interesting about that, actually, in terms of looking at the absolute edge of where money falls away completely, and what will come out of that, what will come out of where people have abandoned the money. And so in the same way that money has killed cultures, culture around growing your own food, making your own food, what possibilities are going to come back for those people who've abandoned cash altogether?
Yeah, I think that becomes really uncomfortable, because if you don't work with the values of capitalists, then they don't know how to get you. So it's really, it is, in a way, it was a story of Yugoslavia in some way as well. This non-aligned situation has, there is a book called Coca-Cola Capitalism by Radina Vucetic. I'm actually going to put it here. That was all about that, about kind of economy of Yugoslavia that has made, I mean, there are all sorts of theories, including the fact that because Yugoslavia was non-aligned, there was an interest from the West to break it apart. So nationalist forces within now 6 states that were republics of Yugoslavia would often talk about this case of breakdown being the fault of the West. I mean, you know, there are truths in everything, right? So maybe that is a good thing to think about. But just to come back to the pedagogy, radical pedagogy, and what is happening at universities, we are having this massive project that everyone else is running at the moment. It's called Decolonizing the Curriculum. Everybody's running Decolonizing the Curriculum. And it's become such a token that actually it warms up the wrong people and it annoys the people that should be involved. So when it's pressed on the staff and the students in that way, from kind of extra interest to be apologetic about the history of colonialism and show that you are acknowledging the suffering and this kind of thing, then it ends up being enforced and hence not welcomed in the way that it should be. And I had a sense from Amrita a little bit that this might be what was happening in Tate as well, because we have some staff. I have some PhD students that are having these collaborative doctorates. You can have a doctorate that is 1 foot in the university and the other foot is in the institution, and some of them work with Tate. And if they are kind of racially conscious, they are really upset about what is going on, what they are presented with. But at universities, we face that every day. However, a way to, I believe that a way to change the institution is to work from inside. So, but then there is a danger as well. Us who were not necessarily part of the kind of dominant or mainstream who came into the institution are used also as tokens, like, you see, there are people like this that work for the institution as well. So that's a problem. And the third part of it is that it's the tendency that you popularize and simplify all possible issues in order to develop that type of the curriculum. So there is a lowering of the, let's say, academic standards that is happening, because we are trying to democratize these kind of elitist curriculum that is reliant on 18th century constructions of the arts context and markets. And so all of that is coming together now. Yeah. Anyway, I'm going to stop.
I just speaking from lived experience. So when I did my master's at Chelsea in 2009, I did a curatorial MA. Every single book on the curriculum, all 200, were by white people from America. I think there's one book by Otterlith Group, which is like the white academics' favorite people of color usually. When it, and like every single tutor, every single guest tutor was like a white person personally connected to either tutor. So when I went into Chelsea 10 years later and I saw these decolonizing fanzines, as crude as they were, I actually found that very affirmative. And I mean, I went through some very serious depressions and thought of giving up. I've never had an institutional position. I'm often a guest lecturer. And often, like when I've been a guest lecturer at Royal College of Art or Goldsmiths, and I meet a student from Pakistan or Iran, they're just so pleased they can speak about entire geographies that they could never speak before. And and in terms of this very common thing said about democratizing knowledge, lowered standards, I actually think like privileging mediocre white mediocrity is actually what lowers standards. And
I think that's a great bombshell. Sorry, Ham, did you want to continue? Or we can keep that
I think there's
in mind.
There's something in zine culture. So I mean, 10 years ago, like you had very centralized platforms like Third Text and Iniva. And what you've seen is this sort of autonomous DIY, multiple centers like DIY Cultures, which is a festival I did. So there's a lot more like autonomy, and it's not like people don't really care about what's written in Art Monthly, or it's just a very decentralized platform. There's lots of little villages rather than one big.
My question is if this radical pedagogy is in the closed circuit, nobody will get it. So I was thinking if there is something that comes out of the need to have that type of pedagogy. It's just, I feel sometimes pedagogy is seen as something that comes and you have to take, but I think you can also, as a learner, you can take instead of just waiting for something to come to you. So this passive idea of the one who listens, it's a bit, it annoys me a little bit, because it's like you offer something, you offer whatever content is, and now it's the colonial content. But how about the readers, the people who get that? How can they work with this unless they only take them and that's it? So that's also for me a question. So where is the radical pedagogy if we just eat what comes to us? Anyway, I don't know.
Yeah, it's a good question, and I think this not to label it, but I think situations such as these, I guess, reading groups and kind of more circular or horizontal ways of sharing knowledge are one one strategy, one element. And I really want to thank everybody for, you know, participating, listening. Listening is also participating, and sharing so much of their knowledge and ideas. And thank you for making it a really fascinating conversation. I took plenty of notes.
I think Christian wanted to say something.
Oh, yes, Christian.
Sorry, I just wanted to have like a comment on pedagogies. So I think what is really interesting that happened right now is that 20 years of digital learning education was implemented in 3 days. And after a 1-hour meeting with teachers and students, I have a sister who's 11, so I can really see that on first hand. And teachers, mothers and fathers and parents and all kinds of, and students are collectively figuring out how to implement this 20 years of innovation into their life. Because this was around, like, I started school in the 2000s. I come from Central Eastern Europe. It was here, but this happened now, and people are like, just have to like, okay, we're gonna be more patient with the teacher who's not able to put up this file. The teachers are more patient with the students. They kind of decrease the amount. The parents have to be more patient, you know, mothers and fathers, and have to stay home with the kids and learn. I think there is actually a conversation in pedagogy. I think it's a very monolithic way to look at some parts of it. I find it really difficult exactly because of the neoliberal university system that we live in, that only supports, you know, box ticking. But I did have teachers who really went to these kind of innovation classes, and there's a lot of possibilities of learning. And it's really like, it became really revealed for me in the one last month that I have been spending here, and kind of also a little bit helping out with this. So I think pedagogy has a possibility of communication. I mean, like, but maybe I'm just too optimistic on that. Thank you.
No, I think it's really important that pedagogy gives you a framework with which you can work even in neoliberal university. And I think it's really important, Hamza, when you talk about white lectures, I think it's also really important to remember that my class is full of people who are not white, and their power, economic power, is much stronger than my own. So the world has changed from the dichotomy black and white is actually incredibly problematic in the conversations that you have with East Europeans, just so you know, considering that you are in Slovenia, I think that needs to be taken into account. And just to apologize, but a dear friend of mine who is white wrote the book that I have just posted on the link. And it is about the Museum of African Art that is in Belgrade. And she wrote about colonialization, and especially a non-aligned movement. And I think her doctorate was on non-aligned movement and art. So that's a reference for everyone to engage with if you're interested in any white writing.
But I feel that if we continue, we can be able to have a conversation regardless of where we come from, right? So I was thinking, I was amazed by this idea, but coming back to Edouard Glissant about the idea of relation. So that how can we relate to each other instead of trying to look always to the differences. So of course we have lots of differences, but there is something that relates us. Otherwise we would not be able to talk, right? If we are all different and say, oh yeah, I'm just different from you and from you and from you, then we might not be able to enter a conversation. So that's the point that sometimes at least bothers me, because if I go to a context, an art context, it's mainly like that. And if you are not following that theory, then you are just not part of the whole conversation. I find it a little bit restrictive in the end. So you try to open your mind, but in the end you're closing into just one point of view. And I don't think that's the way to communicate, because the communication is also about having some frictions and having to discuss things and to get into something else, or maybe this politically correctness, or topics like I cannot talk about this because I'm white and I'm privileged, I'm this and that. This is very problematic, because it is, of course, you have to understand where you are and which are your backgrounds. But if you always stay on that level, then it's very difficult to communicate, even if something bothers you. Because you have to stay, you have to shut up your mouth. It's like a self-censorship. I don't know, I see it sometimes here in Berlin quite often. Some people are not even able to say anything because they have a position of privilege, or on the other way around, they are not able to talk. I don't know. I'm just posing this thing because I think we were able to stay with each other, at least online, for about 2 hours.
Yeah, I mean, I think
about that.
I mean, I'm hopefully not going to speak for Hamza, but I think just from personal experience, I think what Hamza may be pointing to, and maybe for many of us whose heritage is from another place outside of the UK, what I guess for me we're thinking about in Iniva is how do you maybe engage with something that we might refer to as Black study, not as an opposition, but as an understanding that the only education that has been dominating the discourse within university and within histories is not necessarily called white study, but that's what it is. So I think it's not about a kind of polarity. It's not actually even about permissiveness, or it's very much about understanding that everybody has a positionality, and you have to recognize that positionality first in order to work out where you can speak from. Yeah.
I also think it needs to be underlined that even if you get rich Chinese students, so for example, the last place I taught was at Royal College of Art. There's many rich Chinese students, but many of them had experienced racism after Corona, had been voided, had been experienced racist violence. A lot of rich Arab students still experience Islamophobia. One recently got stabbed. I mean, and you shouldn't dismiss that. I find that really violent and fragile to do that. And even like if you take Slovenia, Melania Trump benefits from white privilege in a way Michelle Obama didn't. I mean, that's just a fact. Even though I do understand it's far more complex history, and the Yugoslav partisans probably influenced a lot of third world guerrilla movements, and they've never been they're more a dominated nation. But like but to totally deny that you actually experience, I mean, even in employment, like the recent arrival of like EU migrants from like Poland do get preferential treatment sometimes to Afro-Caribbean in terms of like some welfare state employment, and that just exists. I mean, it's not like you also can't wholesale dismiss some of those things. And I actually resent saying it's just black and white. You know, I strongly align with say the Hillsborough Justice Movement, which is the Irish diaspora in Liverpool experienced like what could only be described as racism under Thatcherism. There was language like managed population decline, and I even the way we've said the West all the time. I mean, the most inspiring anti-colonial movement has been the Irish Republican tradition, which inspired everyone from Harlem Black activism, Marcus Garvey, so on. If you look at Easter Rising, that inspires anti-colonial revolts against whiteness is also a very dynamic like category. So I mean, the Boston Irish in America who supported like Reaganism are certainly white and have certainly like think there's a book called, which no one's read but everyone refers to, called How the Irish Became White. It's far more like dynamic privilege. And then say if the Good Friday Agreement fell apart in occupied Ireland and the 6 counties, or Northern Ireland as British people call it, that would unwave a wave of like anti-Irish like racism again. I mean, so something's also fragile as well, but that's a lot of points made.
Thank you, Hamza, for that. I think, I guess, and for the previous comments around positionality, I think, and kind of thinking about this, there's so much to discuss. I mean, we're definitely not going to cover this, but I would recommend a book that came out last, I think, 2 years ago, by Catherine Baker, kind of looking at race in the context of the specifically in the post-Yugoslav context, where exactly she points out this kind of duality between, let's say, this duality between oppression but also fragility, and kind of, thank you, exactly. It's a really great book, and it's a huge conversation, and I think it's really important to be able to position ourselves while acknowledging acknowledging the very fact of whiteness and privilege. And I think this book in particular points to that and really unpacks some of these tensions and difficult questions. So I encourage you to read that. I'm just quite conscious of time, where yeah, sorry, I'm getting more comments here, but yeah, please, yes, I encourage you to join our next events as well, and yes, we'll try and collate some of this information and some of these links that you've shared. And yeah, please join us again in May as well, and continue to engage. And just a short note at the end, if people are happy, we might want to contact some of you just for feedback, or if you would like just to send us some feedback about this event, please get in touch with us. But thank you very much for joining tonight. I think we're 40 minutes over the 2 hours that we had scheduled. So definitely there's an interest to continue this conversation and to dig deeper into these questions and tensions that have been raised. So thank you all, and see you again very soon.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Thanks to all. Thanks. Bye. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye. Bye. Bye.
Bye.
Bye. Bye.
Bye. Thanks so much for this. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.